Take those ridiculous medals off your suit, Dad. You're embarrassing me. Those were the first words my son said to me on the morning of his wedding. Not good to see you. Not, thanks for coming. Just that. I stood in the private reception hallway of the Grand Monarch Hotel, one hand resting on the lapel of the navy suit I'd carefully pressed the night before. The 3 medals pinned to my chest were small, polished, respectfully placed. I had worn them only twice in the last 15 years. Once at my wife's funeral, and now at my only son's wedding. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. The music from the ballroom drifted through the closed doors behind us. Laughter echoed from somewhere down the corridor. Wedding staff hurried past carrying floral arrangements worth more than my first car. What did you say? I asked quietly. Ethan sighed and rubbed his forehead as if I were creating a problem for him. The medals. Take them off. They look ridiculous. My investors are here. Board members are here. Important people are here. This isn't some military reunion. I looked at my son, 38 years old, CEO of a company that seemed to appear in business magazines every other month. Expensive watch, tailored tuxedo, perfect smile for the cameras. Somewhere along the way, he had become a stranger wearing my son's face. I thought they looked appropriate, I said. It's a wedding. Exactly, he replied. A wedding, not a history exhibit. His words landed harder than he probably intended. Or maybe exactly as hard as he intended. I couldn't tell anymore. Ethan glanced toward the ballroom entrance and lowered his voice. Please, just take them off. I don't want people asking questions. People asking questions. I stared at him for several seconds. The same boy who used to sit cross-legged on the living room floor while I showed him old photographs. The same child who once told his elementary school class that his dad was his hero. Funny how time changes things. Funny how success changes people. All right, I said at last. Relief immediately appeared on his face. Not concern, not guilt. Relief. He patted my shoulder. Thank you. I appreciate it. Then, he walked away toward the ballroom without another word. I remained standing there alone. The hallway suddenly felt much larger than before. Slowly, I reached up and touched the first medal. My fingers lingered on the metal surface. Each one carried a memory. Faces. Names. Moments I had spent decades trying not to relive. Yet none of those memories hurt as much as the conversation I had just had with my son. Carefully, I unpinned one medal and slipped it into my pocket. Then another. Then the third. As I lowered my hand, the last medal caught briefly on the fabric of my jacket. It slipped free from my fingers and fell to the marble floor with a sharp metallic click. The sound was small, barely noticeable, but someone heard it. A voice behind me spoke before I could bend down to retrieve it. Good Lord, the man said softly. That can't be William Carter, can it? I turned slowly and saw a tall man with silver hair standing a few feet away. His tuxedo was immaculate, but it was not his appearance that caught my attention. It was his expression. Recognition. Genuine recognition. He looked from the medal on the floor to my face and then back again. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then his eyes widened slightly. William Carter, he said. I knew it. I studied him carefully. Age changes all of us. It softens some faces and hardens others. At first I could not place him. Then he smiled. Robert Hayes. The name struck me immediately. 25 years disappeared in an instant. General Hayes, I said. Retired now, he replied with a small laugh. And apparently old enough to attend weddings instead of military briefings. He bent down before I could move and picked up the medal from the marble floor. He held it carefully, almost reverently. I never thought I would see one of these lying on a hotel floor. I glanced toward the ballroom doors. Ethan was nowhere in sight. Life surprises us sometimes, I said quietly. General Hayes looked at me for a long moment. He was a man who had spent decades reading people. I could see the questions forming behind his eyes. Questions he was too polite to ask directly. Instead, he handed the medal back to me. You should put it back on. I slipped it into my pocket instead. I think it is fine where it is. Something in my voice must have told him more than I intended. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Understanding settled between us without explanation. I see, he said softly. We stood there for a moment in silence. The wedding guests continued flowing through the hotel like a river of expensive fabric and polished shoes. Laughter drifted from the ballroom. Champagne glasses clinked. Somewhere nearby, a string quartet was rehearsing part of the evening program. It was supposed to be a joyful day, I had spent weeks convincing myself of that. I remembered driving 300 miles from Ohio to Chicago for the wedding. 5 hours alone on the interstate. 5 hours thinking about how proud Margaret would have been. My wife had passed away 6 years earlier, but I still caught myself imagining what she would say in certain moments. She always believed Ethan would find his way back to the values we taught him. Family, respect, gratitude. Looking around now, I wondered if she would still believe that. How long has it been? General Hayes asked. Since we last saw each other? Probably 20 years. Closer to 23, he said. Not that I am counting. For the first time that morning, I smiled. A real smile. Small but genuine. You always were good with details. Comes with the job. His gaze drifted toward the ballroom entrance. Your son is the groom? He is. Successful young man. Very successful. You must be proud. The answer should have been easy. Instead, I found myself staring at the polished floor. Finally, I nodded. I am proud of what he has accomplished. General Hayes did not press further. He simply looked at me with the quiet understanding of someone who had lived long enough to know that complicated answers often hide behind simple words. Then a hotel employee approached carrying a stack of event schedules. She stopped abruptly when she noticed General Hayes. Sir, they are looking for you near the front table. Thank you, he said. As she walked away, I noticed something I had not seen before. His name was printed near the top of one of the schedules, not buried among the guests, not listed with distant relatives, prominently displayed. Featured speaker. My stomach tightened slightly. General Hayes followed my gaze and smiled. Looks like they want me to say a few words tonight. Neither of us realized then just how much those words would change the rest of the evening. After General Hayes disappeared into the crowd, I stood alone for a few moments near the entrance of the ballroom. The medal remained in my pocket. My fingers brushed against it as if reassuring myself it was still there. Eventually, I straightened my jacket and walked inside. The ballroom looked exactly the way people imagine expensive weddings should look. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across the ceiling. White roses covered every table. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago skyline. Everything was elegant. Everything was perfect, at least on the surface. I found my assigned seat near the back of the room. Not at the family table. Not near Ethan. Not even near the wedding party. My place card sat between two people I had never met. One was a venture capitalist from California. The other was an executive from New York. Both were polite. Both spent most of their time discussing acquisitions and quarterly earnings. I listened quietly and nodded when appropriate. It was strange. I had driven hundreds of miles to attend my son's wedding, yet I felt more like an observer than a family member. Across the ballroom, I could see Ethan moving from table to table. Guests greeted him enthusiastically. Cameras followed him everywhere. Every smile seemed carefully practiced. Every handshake looked rehearsed. Several times our eyes nearly met. Each time he looked somewhere else. I told myself not to take it personally. I had been telling myself that for years. As the afternoon continued, old memories began surfacing. Small things at first. Moments I had ignored at the time. 5 years earlier, Ethan had received an industry award in San Francisco. He invited dozens of colleagues. I learned about it from an online article 3 days later. 3 years ago, he hosted a charity gala. Again, I was not invited. When I asked about it, he claimed the guest list had been limited. 2 months later, I saw photographs showing hundreds of attendees. Last Christmas, he scheduled a business trip during our family gathering. The following week, social media revealed he had spent the holiday at a ski resort with clients and friends. Every explanation had sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. The distance between us had not appeared overnight. It had been growing for years. I simply had not wanted to see it. A burst of laughter pulled me back to the present. At the neighboring table, several guests were discussing military service. One younger man glanced toward me. "Were you in the military?" he asked politely. Before I could answer, another guest smiled awkwardly. Not anymore, apparently. A few people chuckled. The comment was harmless on the surface. Yet I found myself touching the empty spot on my lapel where the medals had rested earlier that morning. Not anymore. The words lingered in my mind. The ceremony began shortly afterward. Madison looked beautiful as she walked down the aisle. Her smile was genuine. Her happiness seemed real. Watching her, I felt a brief sense of peace. Whatever flaws existed elsewhere, she appeared to truly love my son. For that alone, I was grateful. As the vows concluded and the guests rose in applause, I noticed something unusual. General Hayes was standing near the front row. Beside him sat several distinguished guests I had not recognized earlier. Former military leaders, civic officials, community figures, people whose names appeared in newspapers and public events. They greeted him with obvious respect. More than once, I saw them glance in my direction. Quiet conversations followed. Curious looks, subtle nods. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but enough to make me wonder what General Hayes had been telling them. Across the room, Ethan noticed it too. For the first time all day, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. The reception began just after sunset. The city lights outside the ballroom windows shimmered against the darkening sky, turning the entire room into a scene from a magazine cover. Waiters moved gracefully between tables. Soft music floated through the air. Guests laughed, toasted, and celebrated. From a distance, it looked like a perfect evening. I sat quietly and watched. Years ago, I would have been moving from table to table, introducing myself, making conversation, telling stories. Age changes many things. So does disappointment. I had learned that not every silence needed to be filled. As dinner was served, I noticed Madison speaking with several guests near the head table. Unlike Ethan, she did not seem obsessed with appearances. She smiled naturally. She listened when people spoke. More than once, I caught her glancing toward me. There was confusion in her expression, as though she sensed something was wrong, but could not quite identify it. During the meal, General Hayes remained surrounded by guests. Several people approached him to shake his hand. Others simply stopped to listen whenever he spoke. His reputation clearly extended far beyond military circles. At one point, I saw him gesture subtly in my direction while speaking with a group near the stage. The reactions were immediate. Heads turned. Curious expressions appeared. One woman covered her mouth. Another man looked genuinely surprised. I focused on my meal and pretended not to notice. A few minutes later, someone stopped beside my table. "Mr. Carter?" a voice asked. I looked up. A woman in her 60s stood there holding a wine glass. "Yes. I just wanted to say it is an honor to meet you." I blinked. "I think you may have me confused with someone else." She smiled. "I do not think so. General Hayes was telling us about you." Before I could respond, another guest joined her. Then another. Within minutes, a small group had gathered around my table. They were polite, respectful, curious. They asked questions about places I had served, people I had known, experiences from decades earlier. Nothing dramatic, nothing boastful. In fact, most of the stories belonged to others. Men and women whose names were rarely remembered outside their own families. As I spoke, I noticed something unusual happening across the room. Madison had stopped listening to the conversation at her table. She was watching ours instead. So was Ethan. The difference was impossible to miss. Madison looked interested. Ethan looked concerned. Eventually, one guest asked a question I had heard many times over the years. "Why do you never talk about your accomplishments?" I smiled faintly. Because they were never mine alone. The group fell silent. Every achievement people associate with me involved dozens of others. Some came home afterward. Some did not. It never felt right to make those stories about myself. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the woman who had approached first reached over and squeezed my shoulder gently. "That explains a lot," she said. Nearby, I noticed Madison quietly excuse herself from her table. She walked toward General Hayes. The two began speaking. At first their conversation seemed casual. Then General Hayes reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and handed her something. A folded document. Madison opened it. Her eyes moved across the page. She looked up at him, then back down, then up again. Whatever she was reading had completely changed her expression. When she turned toward me moments later, there was something in her eyes I had not seen all day. Respect. Genuine respect. Across the ballroom, Ethan saw it happen too. And for the second time that evening, I watched confidence leave his face. The evening continued, but something had shifted. It was subtle at first. A change in the atmosphere. A change in the way people looked at me when they passed my table. Earlier, most guests had seen an elderly man sitting quietly near the back of the room. Now they slowed down. They nodded. Some even introduced themselves. I remained exactly where I was. The room had changed around me. I had not changed at all. Across the ballroom, Madison remained with General Hayes. Their conversation lasted much longer than I expected. Occasionally she glanced toward me, then back at the document in her hands. Finally, she folded it carefully and held it against her chest. Whatever information General Hayes had shared, she was taking it seriously. A few minutes later, she walked directly toward my table. Several nearby conversations faded as people noticed her approach. She stopped beside me and smiled. It was not the polite smile she had worn all day for guests and photographers. This one felt different, more personal, more sincere. "William," she said softly, "may I sit down for a moment?" I gestured toward the empty chair beside me. "Of course." She sat carefully and looked at me for several seconds before speaking again. "I feel like there is a great deal about you that I should have known a long time ago." I smiled faintly. "There is probably a great deal about all of us that remains unknown." She laughed quietly. Then her expression became serious. "Did Ethan ever tell you that I grew up with my grandfather?" I shook my head. "No. He served too. Different generation. Different circumstances. But he taught me that character matters more than titles." She glanced toward the head table where Ethan was speaking with several executives. "Sometimes people forget that. Neither of us said his name. We did not need to." The silence carried enough meaning on its own. Madison looked down at the folded document in her hands. "General Hayes showed me some things." I nodded. "He has always enjoyed surprising people." This was not a surprise. It was a revelation. For a moment, emotion appeared in her eyes. Not pity. Respect. The kind of respect that cannot be purchased or negotiated. It can only be earned over a lifetime. Before I could respond, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone. The room gradually quieted. Glasses were lowered. Conversations ended. Guests turned their attention toward the front of the ballroom. The evening speeches were about to begin. Madison returned to the head table, but before leaving, she placed her hand gently on my shoulder. "I am very glad you came tonight," she said. Then she walked away. I watched her rejoin Ethan. He immediately asked her something. She answered briefly. Whatever she said caused him to look toward me. His expression tightened. Not anger, not embarrassment, something closer to uncertainty. The speeches began with family, friends, and business associates. Most were exactly what people expect at elegant weddings. Stories about success, stories about achievement, stories about bright futures and ambitious goals. The guests applauded politely after each one. Then the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. "Our final speaker this evening requires very little introduction." A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd. "Please welcome General Robert Hayes." Applause filled the ballroom as General Hayes approached the stage. He thanked the audience and congratulated the newlyweds. At first, his remarks seemed entirely appropriate. Warm, respectful, conventional. Then he paused. His eyes moved across the room. Finally, they settled on me. The ballroom grew strangely quiet. General Hayes smiled. "Before I finish," he said, "there is someone here tonight whose presence deserves recognition." And in that instant, every person in the room turned toward my table. For a moment, I considered lowering my head and pretending General Hayes was speaking about someone else. Old habits are difficult to break. Most people who have spent their lives serving others become comfortable in the background. We learn not to seek attention. We learn not to expect recognition. But there was no escaping it now. Hundreds of eyes had turned toward my table. The ballroom fell silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the city beyond the windows. General Hayes rested both hands on the podium and smiled. "Many years ago," he began, "I had the privilege of serving alongside a man whose character impressed me more than any rank ever could." A few guests exchanged curious glances. Others leaned forward in their seats. People often assume leadership is about authority. It is not. Leadership is about responsibility. It is about showing up when others need you most. It is about putting duty ahead of recognition. His gaze remained fixed on me. I shifted slightly in my chair, uncomfortable with where this was heading. William Carter taught that lesson to many of us. The room remained completely still. Across the ballroom, I noticed Madison listening intently. Ethan sat beside her, his posture rigid. General Hayes continued. He did not speak about medals. He did not list accomplishments. Instead, he told stories. Simple stories. Human stories. He spoke about long days when morale was low and William Carter somehow found a way to lift spirits. He spoke about difficult moments when younger service members needed guidance and found it in a man who expected nothing in return. He spoke about integrity, reliability, quiet strength. The kind of qualities that rarely appear on resumes, but shape entire lives. As he spoke, something remarkable happened. The audience stopped seeing an elderly man seated near the back of the room. They began seeing a person, a life, a history. Several guests nodded as they listened. Others wiped discreetly at their eyes. One executive sitting near the front folded his arms and stared at me with a thoughtful expression. General Hayes then reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small photograph. "I carry this picture with me everywhere," he said. The large screen behind the stage, illuminated as event staff, displayed the image for the audience. A younger version of General Hayes appeared on the screen. Beside him stood a younger version of me. We were both smiling. The photograph had been taken decades earlier. Time had faded the colors, but not the memory. A soft murmur moved through the ballroom. People leaned closer to get a better look. "That man beside me," General Hayes said, "never asked for recognition. In fact, he spent most of his life avoiding it, which is exactly why he deserves it." The applause began slowly. A few guests first, then more, then nearly the entire room. I felt my face grow warm. I had never enjoyed being the center of attention, yet there was something different about this moment. It was not about achievement. It was about being seen, truly seen. Through the applause, I looked toward the head table. Madison was smiling, not politely, proudly. Ethan was not applauding. He sat frozen in place, staring at the photograph behind the stage. For the first time that evening, he looked less like a confident executive and more like a confused son. General Hayes waited for the applause to fade before speaking again. "There is one final thing I would like everyone here to know." His voice softened slightly. The greatest accomplishment of William Carter's life was never anything he achieved for himself. It was the family he built. At those words, every eye in the ballroom shifted once more. This time, they did not turn toward me. They turned toward Ethan. The silence that followed felt different from any silence earlier that evening. It was no longer uncomfortable. It was reflective. Guests were no longer focused on the decorations, the music, or the expensive reception. They were thinking about something deeper. General Hayes stood calmly at the podium while the room absorbed his words. Then he smiled toward the head table. "Success is a wonderful thing," he said. "Building a company takes intelligence. Building a reputation takes effort. But building a family takes character." No one moved. No one spoke. Even the servers had stopped walking between tables. "The truth is," he continued, "every achievement stands on a foundation. Sometimes we become so focused on where we are going that we forget who helped us get there." I noticed several guests glance toward Ethan again. Some of them were executives who had spent years praising his leadership. Others were investors whose opinions carried enormous weight in his professional world. Yet none of them looked impressed at that moment. They looked thoughtful. The kind of thoughtful that makes people reconsider things they assumed they understood. General Hayes finished his remarks with a warm congratulations to the newlyweds. Then he stepped away from the podium. The applause that followed lasted much longer than any of the previous speeches. People rose to their feet, one by one at first. Then entire tables stood. I remained seated, unsure what to do. Recognition had never been something I knew how to accept gracefully. Madison stood immediately. She applauded with genuine enthusiasm. Several members of her family did the same. Before long, nearly the entire ballroom was standing. Everyone except Ethan. He remained in his chair for several seconds, staring at the table in front of him. Finally, as though realizing all eyes were on him, he slowly stood as well. His applause was hesitant, mechanical, but he applauded. When the room finally settled, guests began talking among themselves again. Only now the conversations were different. People approached my table not out of curiosity, but out of respect. A retired judge thanked me for my years of service. A business owner introduced his wife and told me he admired General Hayes tremendously. One young man admitted he had spent the last 20 minutes thinking about his own relationship with his father. Each interaction was polite, genuine, human. Across the room, Ethan seemed increasingly uncomfortable. The spotlight he had spent years learning to control had shifted somewhere he never expected. I watched him excuse himself from a group of investors and step outside onto a balcony overlooking the city. Through the glass doors, I could see him standing alone beneath the evening sky. His shoulders were tense, his head lowered. For the first time all day, there were no cameras around him. No audience, no performance, just a man alone with his thoughts. A few minutes later, Madison approached me again. This time she carried 2 glasses of sparkling water. She handed one to me and took the empty seat beside mine. "I think tonight surprised a lot of people," she said. "Including me." I smiled. Weddings are full of surprises. She laughed softly. Then her expression became more serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She looked toward the balcony where Ethan still stood alone. "Why did you never tell us any of this?" It was a fair question, one I had asked myself more than once over the years. I looked down at the glass in my hand. Tiny bubbles drifted slowly toward the surface. "Because I never wanted my life to become a measuring stick for someone else's." Madison sat quietly, listening. "I wanted Ethan to build his own identity," I continued. "His own accomplishments. His own story." She nodded slowly. Then she looked back toward the balcony. "I think tonight he may finally be realizing where that story began." The reception gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but the atmosphere had changed in ways that could not be reversed. Conversations that had once revolved around stock prices, market trends, and expansion plans now carried a different tone. People were talking about family, about character, about legacy. I remained at my table, quietly observing. Age teaches you that some of the most important moments in life happen after people stop speaking. They happen when words settle into someone's conscience. Across the ballroom, Ethan finally stepped back inside from the balcony. His expression was different. The confidence that had defined him all day seemed less certain now. He moved through the crowd shaking hands and thanking guests, but something felt forced. Several people who had eagerly sought his attention earlier were no longer focused entirely on him. More than once, I noticed investors and executives redirect conversations toward General Hayes or toward me. Not because they were trying to embarrass Ethan, simply because respect has a way of attracting attention naturally. It does not need marketing. It does not need strategy. It does not need a carefully crafted image. At one point, I saw Ethan approach a group of business leaders near the stage. I recognized several of them from magazine articles and television interviews. They greeted him warmly enough. Yet within moments, one of them glanced across the room toward my table. Another nodded thoughtfully. Their conversation shifted. Ethan listened, then listened some more. He was no longer leading the discussion. For perhaps the first time in years, he was hearing perspectives he had not anticipated. Meanwhile, guests continued stopping by my table. A retired school principal shared stories about her father. A physician spoke about the importance of humility in leadership. A young entrepreneur admitted that he had spent most of his career chasing recognition without ever considering whether he deserved it. Their words were kind, but I understood something they did not. This evening was never really about me. It was about Ethan. The room had become a mirror, and for the first time in a long while, he was being forced to look into it honestly. Later in the evening, Madison returned to the dance floor with several members of her family. Music filled the ballroom again. Laughter returned. Yet every so often, I would catch her looking toward Ethan with concern. She loved him. That much was obvious. But love does not prevent disappointment. Sometimes it makes disappointment hurt even more. As the evening progressed, I noticed another subtle change. Guests who had spent years admiring Ethan's professional accomplishments were now evaluating something else entirely. Not his company, not his wealth, not his title, his character. That realization seemed to trouble him deeply. Several times our eyes met across the ballroom. For the first time all day, he did not immediately look away. Instead, he seemed uncertain, like someone trying to solve a problem he had spent years avoiding. Near 10 o'clock, the music softened and many guests began preparing to leave. Some collected coats. Others exchanged final congratulations. The celebration was winding down. I considered leaving quietly before the crowd thinned further. It seemed like the simplest option, the easiest option. I reached for my jacket and slowly stood from my chair. At that exact moment, I noticed Ethan moving toward me through the crowd. He was no longer surrounded by executives. No photographers followed him. No audience watched his every move. For the first time that entire day, he was simply a son walking toward his father. His pace was slow, deliberate. As he approached, I could see something in his eyes that had been missing for years. Not confidence, not ambition, not pride, regret. Ethan stopped a few feet from my table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Around us, the reception continued winding down. Guests gathered their belongings. Chairs shifted across the floor. Soft music drifted through the ballroom. Yet everything else seemed distant. It was just the two of us, father and son, something we had not truly been in a very long time. He looked older than he had that morning. Not physically, emotionally, as though a single evening had forced him to confront years of choices he had carefully avoided examining. "Dad," he said quietly. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from him. Not because he had stopped using it, because he had stopped meaning it. I waited. He looked down, briefly before meeting my eyes again. "I owe you an apology." There was no audience now. No executives listening. No investors observing. No social expectations directing the conversation. Only honesty, raw and uncomfortable. "You did not deserve what I said earlier." His voice faltered slightly. "You did not deserve any of it." I studied his face. For years I had imagined this moment. Not the specifics, just the possibility that one day he might finally understand. Strangely, now that it was happening, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only sadness for the time we had lost. "Why?" I asked gently. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I spent so many years trying to fit into a world that judged everything." He glanced around the ballroom. Success, status, image, influence. He shook his head. "At some point I became afraid of anything that reminded people where I came from." The admission seemed to cost him something. I could see it. "Including me," I said. He nodded. "Including you." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The truth was painful, but at least it was finally visible, like a wound that could only begin healing once uncovered. Ethan looked toward the large screen where the old photograph still remained displayed among the evening's images. I convinced myself that I was building something bigger than my past. He laughed bitterly. Tonight, I realized my past was the reason I had anything to build at all. I followed his gaze toward the photograph. A younger version of myself smiled back from decades earlier. Beside me stood General Hayes. Behind us existed countless memories, sacrifices, and lessons that had shaped the course of an entire family. Not because of medals, not because of recognition, because of responsibility, because of love. Ethan's eyes glistened slightly under the ballroom lights. "I am sorry, Dad." The words were simple, unpolished, real. I thought of Margaret. I thought of the countless nights she defended Ethan whenever I worried about the growing distance between us. She always believed he would find his way back eventually. Maybe she had been right. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed the 3 medals. They rested quietly in my palm. Small pieces of metal carrying decades of memories. Ethan stared at them, then lowered his eyes. "I was ashamed of the wrong things," he whispered. I closed my fingers around the medals and smiled. These were never the important part. He looked confused. They were not. I shook my head. "No." I placed a hand on his shoulder. The important part was what they represented. Integrity, sacrifice, responsibility. Those things do not belong on a jacket. They belong in a person's life. He stared at me for a long moment, then slowly nodded. I could see understanding settling into place. Not complete understanding. That would take time, but enough. Finally, I picked up my coat. The reception was ending. Guests were leaving. Madison approached and embraced me warmly. General Hayes shook my hand one last time. Then I turned toward the exit. Ethan walked beside me until we reached the ballroom doors. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Some silences are not empty. Some are healing. Before I stepped into the hallway, Ethan spoke one final time. "I am proud to be your son." I looked at him and saw not a chief executive officer, not a public figure, not a successful businessman, just my boy, older now, wiser perhaps, still learning, just like the rest of us. I smiled. That is all I ever wanted to hear. Then I walked into the quiet hallway, leaving behind the noise, the applause, and the attention. The medals remained in my pocket, right where they belonged.